She arrived at that question the way she arrived at most things now, without ceremony. Because ceremony was a thing for people who still had the time for it. Willa had asked it of drummers and drifters and men selling tonics out of wagon beds, and she had never once meant it as more than what it was. A kitchen with a light still burning. A woman with more bread than mouths, some weeks, and more mouths than bread on others. She did not know that Wednesday, that the question would matter. She only knew the stranger on her porch looked like a man who had not been asked anything kind in a long while. He did not answer right away. That was the first thing she noticed, and the second was that his hands were still, folded. The way a man folds his hands when he has learned not to reach for things that are not offered. "Have you eaten?" she asked him, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to place. Some memory of a table, some memory of being wanted at one. When he finally spoke, it was 3 words, plain and unadorned, and they were enough. They were more than enough. They were the kind of answer that does not ask to be let in, and gets let in anyway. The town would come to have opinions about this. Towns always did. A woman alone, feeding a man whose name she did not know, whose road she could not trace back past the horizon he had walked in from. There would be a woman at the mercantile with a voice made for spreading things faster than they could be caught. There would be a man circling her land like a buyer circles a widow's grief, patient, certain that patience was the same thing as right. None of it would matter yet. Not on that Wednesday. Not with the bread still warm and the coffee not yet poured. What passes between 2 people at a table is rarely spoken of afterward, and rarer still is it spoken of while it is happening. It moves in smaller currency. A second helping offered without asking. A chair mended before it is noticed as broken. A silence that does not need filling. Some things are too large for naming, and this was one of them, sitting quiet in a kitchen at the edge of a town that had already decided what kind of woman fed strangers and what kind of man let himself be fed. This is the story of what a single question can hold, when it is asked plainly and answered honestly, and what it can build, slow as a fence line, slow as a winter passing into water again. It is the story of a table that stayed set longer than anyone expected, and a stranger who came for a meal and stayed for reasons neither of them said aloud. It begins, as these things often do, with almost nothing at all. A knock, a question, an answer that was not a lie. The town of Corinne Flat sat at the edge of a stretch of country that had not decided yet whether it wanted to be farmland or dust, and most weeks it leaned toward dust. Willa Kestrel had lived there long enough to know its moods the way she knew her own kitchen, by feel more than by sight. She had come as a bride 9 years past, young and certain of things she no longer let herself name. Her husband had been dead 3 winters now, taken by a fever that moved through the valley faster than anyone could pray against it, and she had been left with his debts, his land, and his sister's 2 children, who called her Aunt Willa in voices still small enough to break something in her chest if she let them. It was a Wednesday when the stranger came, and Willa would remember that fact long after she had forgotten the color of the sky that evening or what she had been cooking when the knock came. Wednesdays had a particular weight to them in her ledger of days. It was the day the supply wagon passed, the day she settled what accounts she could, the day she counted what remained in the flour bin and decided how thin the week ahead would need to stretch. She had been standing at the stove with her sleeves pushed to the elbow, stirring a pot that held more water than it had any right to call broth, when the knock came soft against the frame of her open door. He stood at the edge of the porch light the way a man stands when he has learned not to presume upon a threshold. His coat was thin for the season and patched at one shoulder with a hand that had not matched the thread. His boots had walked further than boots were meant to walk without complaint, and his hat sat low enough that she did not see his eyes until he lifted his chin. Slow, careful, the way a man moves when he is not asking for anything. He said nothing at first. He only stood and waited and let the silence do whatever work silence was meant to do between two strangers at a door. Willa had asked the question of a great many men who passed through Corin Flat. Drummers with cases full of tonics nobody wanted. Ranch hands between jobs, drifting toward wherever work was rumored to be better paid. Once, a preacher who ate 3 helpings and left a blessing in place of coin, which she had not been able to spend but had kept anyway, folded into the family Bible. She asked the question now the way she asked it of all of them, plain, without ceremony, because ceremony was a luxury for people who still had the hours to spend on it. "Have you eaten?" she said. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was a habit worn smooth by repetition, the kind of thing a woman says when her hands are busy and her heart has learned to keep its distance from strangers. He did not answer at once. She noticed that about him before she noticed much else. The way he let a question sit before he touched it, as though words were coin too, not to be spent carelessly. When he did speak, his voice was low and unhurried, roughened at the edges the way a voice gets when it has gone unused for longer stretches than most voices are asked to endure. "Not since Sunday, ma'am," he said. 3 words, no apology in them, no plea. Just the fact of it, laid down plain as a stone on a table. And somehow that plainness was what moved her, though she could not have said why if asked. She stepped back from the door without deciding to, the way a body sometimes moves ahead of the mind's permission. "Come in then," she told him, and did not soften the words with anything more than they needed. He wiped his boots on the boards outside with a care that surprised her, as though her floor mattered to him more than his own comfort did, and he removed his hat before he crossed her threshold, holding it against his chest the way a man holds something he is not sure he has the right to bring inside. The children were asleep already, thank the mercy of early bedtimes, and the house held only the 2 of them and the low crackle of the stove and the smell of thin broth trying to be supper. She set a bowl before him without asking his name, and he did not offer it, and there was nothing strange in that omission, not in a country where a man's past was his own business until he chose to make it someone else's. He ate slowly, deliberately, the way a man eats who has learned that hunger answered too fast can undo a stomach gone too long without. He did not reach for a second helping, though she could see plain in the set of his shoulders that he wanted one. And when she ladled more into his bowl without being asked, his eyes came up to hers for the first time, and something passed between them that neither one gave a name to. Some things are too large for naming, and this was one of them. Sitting quiet at her table like a third guest neither had invited, he thanked her twice, once when the bowl was empty, and once again when she offered him the lean-to by the barn for the night, out of the wind, out of whatever weather was coming down from the mountains. He asked nothing further of her. He did not ask about the debts she carried, or the children sleeping down the hall, or the land that was failing to yield what her husband had promised it would yield when he'd first walked her across it as a bride. He only nodded and thanked her, and went out into the dark toward the barn with his hat back low over his eyes. And Willa stood in her doorway a moment longer than she needed to, watching the shape of him go, before she closed the door against the cold. By morning, the story had already begun its slow crawl toward the mercantile, the way stories did in towns too small to hold their own secrets. Mabel Ordway, who kept the counter and the town's opinions in equal supply, would have something to say about a widow feeding a stranger with no name and no history worth speaking of, and she would say it to anyone who paused long enough to listen. But that was a matter for later mornings. On this one, Willa woke before the children, as she always did, and found the wood already split and stacked by the kitchen door, more of it than she had cut in a week, and no one in sight to thank for it. She stood there a long moment with her hand on the cold wood, the way a woman stands when she has been given something she did not ask for and does not yet know what it will cost her to accept. His name wisdom, when she finally learned it, came sideways, the way most true things did with him. She found it stitched faint into the collar of a shirt drying on her line, Nathan Cole, in thread gone soft with age. And she said it to herself twice before she said it aloud to him, testing the weight of it. He did not make a ceremony of confirming it. He only nodded when she used it, the way a man nods at a fact he has long since made peace with, and went on mending the fence post he had been working since sunup. She did not ask why he had wandered as far from wherever Nathan Cole had started as he seemed to have wandered. Some questions, she had learned, were better left where they lay. He did not leave the morning after that first Wednesday, nor the morning after that. He offered no explanation for staying, and she asked for none. And between them grew an arrangement built entirely of work done rather than words spoken. He fixed the flue on her stove, which had smoked every winter since her husband died, and no one had known how to right it. He mended the porch step that had swayed underfoot for 2 years, and rehung the barn door on hinges that no longer complained when the wind pushed through them. In exchange, she fed him and folded an extra blanket for the lean-to, and neither of them called it wages because wages implied a bargain, and this had not yet become a bargain in either of their minds. The children took to him before she did, the way children often take to quiet men, sensing something in the stillness that grown people are too guarded to trust outright. Daniel, who was 7 and given to asking questions faster than they could be answered, followed him around the yard with a persistence that would have worn thin on a less patient man. Nathan answered what he could and let the rest pass unanswered, and Daniel seemed satisfied with that arrangement in a way he was rarely satisfied with anything. Little Josephine, not yet 5, said almost nothing to him for the first 2 weeks, only watched him from behind Willa's skirts with the frank suspicion of the very young, until the afternoon he built her a small wooden horse from a scrap of fence rail, and after that she watched him differently. Supper became the hour around which the day arranged itself, though none of them would have said so plainly. Willa found herself cooking a little more than the ledger strictly allowed, a little more than thin broth and yesterday's bread, and telling herself it was only sensible, since a man working a full day's labor could not run on nothing. She set his place at the table without being asked across from her own, and it was Daniel who noticed first that this was different from how the drummers and drifters had been fed, seated on the porch step with a plate balanced on their knee. Nobody remarked on it. It simply became the shape the evenings took, the way a path becomes a path only after enough feet have worn it. He did not speak much even then, but what he said had weight to it, the way a coin has weight, small and solid and not easily mistaken for something else. "More molasses," she said to him once, sliding the jar closer without looking up from her plate. And he said only, "I know," in a voice that suggested he had already noticed the emptiness of his cup before she had. It was not much of an exchange. It was, she thought later, lying awake and listening to the house settle around her, one of the fuller conversations she had held with anyone since her husband died, and she did not examine too closely why that should be so. The town noticed, as towns do, before either of them had fully admitted to noticing themselves. Mabel Ordway at the Mercantile began asking after Willa's health, with a particular tilt to her voice that implied the asking was not really about her health at all. "There is a man out at your place," Mabel said one Thursday, handing over a sack of cornmeal with more care than the transaction required. "Folks are wondering how long he intends to stay." Willa answered that he was earning his keep same as anyone, and left it at that, though she felt the weight of the question follow her out the door and down the road, the way certain remarks have a way of following a person longer than they have any right to. Not everyone in Corinne Flat shared Mabel's appetite for suspicion. Old Harriet Voss, who had buried 2 husbands of her own and had little patience left for other people's gossip, told Willa plainly one Sunday after service that a woman raising 2 children alone had better sense than to turn away a pair of capable hands, and that anyone who said different had likely never split a cord of wood in a Montana winter. Willa carried that remark home with her like something warm tucked inside her coat, and found herself standing a little straighter when she passed the mercantile window the following week, though she could not have said precisely why Harriet's blessing should matter more than Mabel's doubt. What passed between Willa and Nathan in those weeks was rarely spoken and never named, built instead from small accumulations that neither of them counted aloud. A chair mended before its wobble had been mentioned. A second lamp lit on the porch rail of an evening, so the path from the barn was not so dark. A plate kept warm past its hour, on nights he worked later than the light allowed. He did not reach for these gestures the way a man reaches for what he believes owed to him. He accepted them the way a man accepts weather, without comment, and thanked her for the meal each night with the same plain sincerity he had shown that first Wednesday, as though gratitude were a discipline he practiced rather than a feeling he assumed. Some things are too large for naming, and the shape of what was growing between them was one of those things, quiet as bread rising under a cloth, unremarked upon, until the morning it could no longer be denied. Willa found herself watching for him now when the light began to fail, the way a woman watches for weather she has learned to trust. She did not call it anything. She only noted, privately, the way a man moves when he is not asking for anything, and found she had stopped bracing herself against his presence in her kitchen, the way she had braced herself, without quite realizing it, against every stranger who had crossed her threshold since her husband died. The days went on plain and ordinary, wood split and bread baked and fences mended, and beneath the plainness of them something was quietly, carefully, being built. Harvey Pruitt came to Corin Flat the way certain weather comes, announced by nothing, felt before it was seen. He dealt in land the way other men dealt in cattle or grain, buying low from those too tired or too desperate to hold out, and selling high to whoever came after with money enough to forget where the bargain had come from. He had heard, as men like Harvey always seemed to hear, that Willa Kestrel's husband had left more debt than land could easily answer for, and that a widow with 2 children and a failing well might welcome an offer, provided it was dressed up plain enough to look like mercy. He came on a Thursday, driving a trap with a horse too fine for the errand, and found Willa in the yard hanging wash, her sleeves rolled and her hands raw from the lye soap she could not afford to use as sparingly as she should have. He tipped his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who had learned that manners cost nothing and often bought a great deal. "Mrs. Kestrel," he said, "I've come to talk business if you've a moment to spare a neighbor." She did not have a moment to spare, not really, but she wiped her hands on her apron and gave him one anyway, because refusing outright was not a habit the town had taught her to trust. His offer, when it came, was modest enough to sound reasonable and small enough to insult her if she had let herself examine it too closely. He named a figure for the land that would have cleared her husband's debts and left little else, and he framed it as a kindness, a way to spare her the burden of a place too large for a woman alone to hold on to through another hard winter. Willa listened without interrupting, the way she had learned to listen to men who mistook her patience for uncertainty. And when he finished, she told him plainly that the land was not for sale, and that she had managed 2 winters alone already and expected to manage a third. Harvey smiled at that, the smile of a man who has heard refusal before and does not consider it final. He did not leave it there. Over the following 2 weeks, he found reasons to pass by her fence line at hours when he might be seen, and he made a point of mentioning, to anyone in the mercantile who would listen, that it seemed a shame for good land to go to waste under the management of a widow too proud to accept sensible help. Mabel Ordway carried the remark home and repeated it with relish, and it found its way back to Willa the way such remarks always did, second-hand and sharpened in the telling. She said nothing about it at her own table, but Nathan, who missed little despite saying less, noticed the tightness that had crept into her shoulders when she came back from town those days, and asked her once plain if something troubled her. She told him eventually because there seemed no good reason not to, and because keeping it from him had begun to feel like its own kind of dishonesty in a house where so much else went unspoken, but little went concealed. Nathan listened the way he listened to most things, without interrupting, his hands still on the knife he had been using to whittle a peg for the barn door. When she finished, he said only that he would go into town with her on Saturday, when she meant to settle her account at the bank, and there was nothing in his voice that suggested argument, only fact. The way a man states whether he intends to walk through regardless of what it does to him. The bank in Corinne Flat was a single room with a single clerk and a manager, Otis Fenn, who owed Harvey Pruitt enough favors that his sympathies leaned, however quietly, in the direction of whoever might make Harvey's business easier. Willa had come to discuss an extension on the note her husband had taken against the land, the interest on which had grown heavier than she liked to think about, and she found Otis's manner cooler than she had hoped, his answers vaguer, his glances sliding toward the door as though expecting someone. Harvey arrived, as it happened, within the quarter hour, with the easy timing of a man who had arranged to be somewhere convenient. He renewed his offer there in the bank, before Otis Fenn and whoever else cared to overhear, and this time he let a little more of himself show through the courtesy, a faint impatience at being refused a second time by a woman he plainly believed should have been grateful for the asking. Nathan had said nothing since they entered, standing a step behind Willa's shoulder with his hat in his hands, but at this he moved forward, not fast, not sharp, simply present in a way that changed the shape of the room. He did not raise his voice. He said only that Mrs. Kestrel had given her answer, and that a man of business ought to know better than to ask a settled question twice in front of witnesses. Harvey looked at him then, truly looked, the way a man looks at something he had not accounted for in his figuring, and something in Nathan's stillness must have told him more than words could have, because he did not press further that day. He gathered his hat and made some remark about no offense intended, and left the bank with rather less of his earlier ease than he had brought into it. Otis Fenn, perhaps recalculating which way his sympathies ought now to lean, found after all that an extension could be arranged, and Willa left the bank with her note renewed, and her land, for the moment, entirely her own. It was on the ride home, the wagon creaking beneath them and the children asleep against Willa's side in the back, that Daniel stirred just enough to murmur something into the quiet, half dreaming, not fully awake. "Is Nathan staying, Mama?" he asked, the words slipping out unguarded the way words do from a boy not yet aware of what he has said, and neither adult corrected him. Though Willa felt the word land somewhere in her chest, she had not expected it to reach. Nathan's hand, resting on the wagon seat between them, moved perhaps an inch closer to hers, beside it, not over it, and stayed there the rest of the way home, and neither of them spoke of it, because some things are too large for naming, and this, plainly, was one of them. The fence line held after that. Harvey did not return, not that season, and if he mentioned Willa's land again in the mercantile, it was with rather less certainty than before. The town's gossip did not vanish, not all at once, but it changed its character, softened at the edges, the way frost softens once the sun has been on it long enough. Not unkindly, but without any hurry, Corinne Flat began to make room in its imagining for the shape of a family it had not expected to see form on the Kestrel land. And Willa, watching Nathan mend the last of the fence Harvey's visits had rattled her into worrying over, found she no longer minded what shape the town decided to imagine. Winter came early that year, the way it sometimes did in that country, arriving in November with a hard frost that closed the last of the passes and turned the road to town into something better left untraveled unless the need was great. Willa had grown accustomed, over the months since that first Wednesday, to counting her stores differently, no longer wondering whether there would be enough, but simply seeing to it that there was, because there was a man in the barn each night now whose portion mattered to her as much as her own, or the children's. Nathan had built a second stall for a horse she had not asked him to keep, a sway-backed old gelding no one else in the county wanted, and she had not questioned the expense because she had come to understand that his gestures, however small, were never idle. Harvey Pruitt sent word once more before the season fully turned, not in person this time, but through Otis Fenn. A folded note suggesting the offer for the land still stood, should circumstances change. Willa read it once at her kitchen table, standing, still in her coat from the cold walk back from the mailbox, and then folded it again and set it beneath the lamp on the sideboard, where it stayed unanswered through the whole of that winter and the spring that followed, until eventually no one thought to ask after it at all. The silence that met Harvey's note was, in its way, as complete an answer as any letter could have given, and Corinne Flatt understood it well enough not to require a repetition. The town's opinion of the arrangement at the Kestrel place had shifted by then into something closer to acceptance than to gossip, though it had not arrived there in any single dramatic moment. It had come the way most changes of heart come in small towns, through 100 unremarked observations. Nathan at church on Sunday mornings, standing beside Willa and the children with his hat in his hands. Nathan carrying flour sacks for Harriet Voss without being asked, and mending old Simmons's wagon wheel one Saturday for no more payment than a plate of supper. Mabel Ordway, who had once made her doubts a matter of public record, found less and less occasion to voice them, and when she did not voice them, the town, taking its cue as towns do, largely let the matter rest. Not unkindly, but without any hurry, Corinne Flatt had made up its mind, and its silence was as close to an apology as it was ever going to offer. It was Josephine, small and solemn and not given to unnecessary words, who said the thing neither adult had yet permitted themselves to say aloud. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring, the frost only just beginning to loosen its grip on the fields, and Nathan had lifted her onto his shoulders to see over the new fence he had strung along the pasture edge, and she had wrapped her small hands into his hair and said, plain as anything, "Papa, look how far I can see." He went very still beneath her, the way a man goes still when something he has wanted without daring to name it is handed to him, without warning. And Willa, watching from the porch step with a dish towel forgotten in her hands, felt something in her chest loosen that had been held tight for longer than she had realized. He did not correct the child. That more than anything he might have said, told Willa what she had perhaps already known and simply not permitted herself to examine too closely. He set Josephine down gently at the fence rail and came to where Willa stood, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because some things are too large for naming, and this surely was the largest of them yet. When he finally did speak, it was not grand, not the sort of declaration a lesser story might have reached for. He said only that he had been thinking he ought to build a proper room onto the house, come summer, if she'd no objection to it, and she understood well enough what he was asking without asking, and said that she supposed a room would be a sensible addition, and that was the whole of it. The following Sunday, standing together at the edge of the churchyard, while the congregation filed past with nods that had grown warmer over the months, Harriet Voss took Willa's hand in both of hers and said she was glad to see the place looking so well tended again, land and family both, and that some things a person simply knew when they saw them, whether the paper had caught up with the truth of it or not. Willa thanked her and did not correct the implication, because it was, by then, near enough to true that correcting it would have served no purpose but pride, and pride had never put bread on her table the way plain, honest work had. He unpacked the satchel at last that spring, the one he had carried in on that first Wednesday and never fully emptied, as though some part of him had kept it ready in case the arrangement proved temporary after all. Willa found him at it one evening, setting a worn photograph of people she did not recognize onto the shelf beside her husband's old Bible, not replacing it, only joining it, the way a life joins another life without erasing what came before. She asked him nothing about the photograph, and he offered nothing more than what the gesture itself said, and she understood that this, too, was answer enough. the way his answer at her door had once been answer enough. The fire burned low in the hearth that night, the way it burned every night now, banked carefully before bed by hands that had learned the particular needs of that particular stove. The wind moved through the pines beyond the pasture the way it had moved through them every winter of Willa's life in that valley, indifferent to the small human arrangements being settled beneath its passing. The horse stood quiet in the corral, breath rising pale in the cold, and smoke climbed steady from the chimney into a sky already gathering toward stars. And the river beyond the far field ran on under its skin of thinning ice, patient, unhurried, the way rivers are patient with whatever the seasons choose to do above them. The world continued, as it always had, and within it, quietly, a family had continued too. And that was the story of Willa Kestrel and Nathan Cole, a woman who once asked a stranger a plain question, out of habit alone, and a man whose honest answer was enough to earn him a seat, and then a home, and then a family he had not known he was still permitted to want. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. Thank you.